Hello and welcome to On Point. This episode features a conversation between Dr. Scott Parsons, Character Education Development Integrator for the military program at the United States Military Academy at West Point, and Dr. Tom Harrison, Director of Education at the Jubilee Center for Character and Virtue at the University of Birmingham. Dr. Harrison's specialist interests include character, cyber wisdom and the internet, character education and virtue ethics, and youth social action and citizenship education. He researches, publishes, and gives presentations in the UK and internationally in these areas. He also develops resources and training programs for schools, the voluntary sector, and other organizations. In this episode of On Point and the West Point Association for Graduates Character Cut series, Dr. Tom Harrison talks about how he coined the term cyber-phronesis, its relevance at West Point in training young leaders, and the models he came up with for cultivating character in children. Dr. Harrison also talks about his most recent book that focuses on how to cultivate character in your children so they can flourish online. Now, please enjoy this interview between Dr. Scott Parsons and Dr. Tom Harrison.
Good day, everyone. Welcome to the Character Cut podcast. I'm Dr. Scott Parsons, retired U.S. Army officer and the Character Development Integrator for the military program in the Character Integration Advisory Group here at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Thank you for listening to today's podcast. Character Cut brings together civilian expertise with Army officership. The virtue that we will be discussing today is cyber-phronesis, or online practical wisdom, a topic that is not only important for West Point cadets, but other young people, to include enlisted soldiers and officers in the military. It is my distinct honor and privilege to have Dr. Tom Harrison as our guest today on Character Cut. Dr. Harrison is a reader, an HEA Principal Fellow, and National Teaching Fellow. He is also Director of Education at the Jubilee Center for Character and Virtues, and the Program Director for the MA in Character Education at the University of Birmingham. Tom is also the Books Editor for the British Journal of Educational Studies, Secretary and Trustee for the Society for Educational Studies, and Secretary and Trustee for the Association for Character Education. Tom's expertise and interests are in character, cyber wisdom and the internet, character education and virtue ethics, youth social action, and citizenship education. Tom researches, publishes, and gives presentations in the United Kingdom and internationally in these areas, as well as developing resources and training programs for schools, the voluntary sector, and other organizations. His most recent book is Thrive: How to Cultivate Character So Your Children Can Flourish Online, and it was published in the UK last January 2021, and here in the US the next month in February. Tom is also the host of the wildly popular Conversations on Character podcast. Conversations on Character engages leading figures from across politics, education, and research, and asks them to reflect on their personal understanding of character development and to answer questions about how a focus on character has advanced the sector in which they work. It is my distinct honor and privilege to welcome Dr. Tom Harrison. Tom, welcome to Character Cut.
Thank you very much indeed. It feels strange to be on the other side with you hosting and me as a guest this time, but hopefully I can give some useful insights from this side.
Tom, I wanted to start off by talking about your book. It was an incredible book. I really enjoyed reading it, and it's titled Thrive: How to Cultivate Character So Your Children Can Flourish Online. And it's a book that you can get on Amazon.com or Amazon.co.uk. And as I understand it, your daughter Isla getting her first smartphone was the impetus for the book and the idea for actually cyber-phronesis. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Really, the history of this book started in when I started my PhD quite a long time ago now, when I was looking at the influence of the internet on the character virtues of 11 to 14-year-olds. And I completed that PhD and I did some further research beyond it. But it was only when my daughter was just about to get her smartphone, her first smartphone, when she was leaving primary school in the UK, moving to secondary school in the UK, around the age of 11, that I suddenly realised that I had all this theoretical knowledge, but not any idea about how this was going to play out practically. And particularly given kind of friends, colleagues and others were looking at me thinking, here's a real life experiment of Tom's research and practice, there was suddenly kind of a fear within me of thinking, do I really know how to help my daughter live the most flourishing life she can in the digital age, given all the challenges, risks, and indeed obviously opportunities that come about with living in the digital age where children have such powerful tools in their hand. So that's what the book was really about. It was my exploration, looking through the research, going back over my theory and speaking to parents and observations around me to think about what actual practical steps or advice might I be able to suggest to other parents in my situation when their children first get their smartphones, what might be kind of the best advice that I could give. And just the core focus of that book is on character and wisdom. You described cyber-phronesis. I'm sure we'll talk more about that. But just in terms of character, what was clear to me was that a lot of the parenting advice to date had been about the rules that I needed to put in place for my daughter, how to manage her use of phone, where she could go, what she could use it for, which was absolutely necessary and clear. And we did put a lot of those blocks on. But I was very aware that when she left the home, or when she was outside of kind of the home, or obviously when she left us, when she grew up, those rules wouldn't be in place anymore. So ultimately, she needed to develop the character qualities and, as we'll come on to, wisdom that would allow her to make the best possible decisions using her smartphone, but indeed in the digital age more broadly. So the core focus on the book is about the cultivation of character and wisdom.
So let me ask kind of a follow-up question. So as someone who works in the field of character education, I know that in the Aristotelian sense, phronesis is practical wisdom. And you in your book and in our conversations, you talk about cyber-phronesis. Can you define that and maybe describe in a little more detail what cyber-phronesis is?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, phronesis is the Aristotelian term that's normally translated, as you say, as practical wisdom. Or a lot of the theory that myself and also the centre that I work at, the Jubilee Centre at the University of Birmingham, is based on more virtue ethical theory that originates in Aristotelian philosophy. So hence we use a lot of the kind of concepts and ideas from that time, but bringing them up to date for the current world. And phronesis is one of those incredibly kind of useful concepts that many people understand as soon as you start to explain that it's about the decisions that we make day in, day out when faced with different sorts of dilemmas and quandaries. So phronesis is normally translated as practical wisdom and maybe best defined as making the right decision at the right time, in the right place, in the right amount. I added the prefix cyber for a number of reasons. One of them is in its etymology. Cyber itself, in Greek etymology, from where the term cyber came from, has been taken from the term helmsman. And I just thought that was really nice fit with phronesis, because what we're ultimately looking for is children to, indeed all of us, to find a path, the best way to navigate through all the kind of more complexities and contours of the worlds we actually live in. And phronesis is not about telling children how to behave or fixing the kids. It's about helping them to be able to make better decisions themselves, to be the helmsman, to be those steering their use of technologies ultimately. So cyber seemed to fit very nicely, going back to that etymology. And then, as I say, the term wisdom or phronesis very much draws from that Aristotelian philosophy about, helping children make good moral decisions, in particular kind of virtues clash with each other, but also finding out kind of the right level of a kind of the virtue to show in any particular decision. So it's very much about autonomous kind of judgment and thinking in particular situations that children face themselves in.
That's great, Tom. And that makes a lot of sense. And I know that you've worked with primary school and secondary school. You also work with the graduate students where you run the Master's in Character Education program at the University of Birmingham. And so I know that you speak to a variety of groups about this and talk to a variety of age levels. And those of us that work at West Point, our primary concern are these cadets that generally fall into the category of 18 to 22 years old, maybe slightly older. And so I was just curious why you might think that cyber-phronesis would be particularly relevant to cadets at West Point.
Yeah, I mean, the path to kind of full wisdom is never really completed. I don't think any of us can say that we're ever kind of fully wise in a kind of a moral sense, mainly because new situations and challenges come at us all the time. Look at the number of new quandaries and dilemmas that just living in the digital age has thrown up, and etc. So, but it is considered that, we hopefully become more wise over time. And in particular, when children leave, as I've already said, the security of homes and schooling where they may be used to quite normal or kind of situations situation and rules around them and what's the boundaries and the expectations, and go out into the world, whether it to be as a student and leave home or to go into employment, then that's when their phronesis, their practical wisdom really particularly needs to kick in those settings, because there is different sorts of freedoms or situations they're going to have to face. I imagine within the cadets, there's clearly very much a rule-based system within a lot of kind of cadet training in terms of those expectations, but there will still be different ways they're going to have to learn to live and work alongside and study alongside different sorts of even colleagues. They're living away from the home, for many of them perhaps the first time, throwing up dilemmas and situations and moral quandaries where rules will not necessarily exist in those sorts of situations, or even if the rules exist, they're going to have to take a character-based approach to think about how best to interpret that rule in those particular situations. So I think it's a very important time in children and young people's lives, because they're moving out of these sort of situations where familiarity and boundaries are much more in place to that sense of freedom. So, I mean, my feeling is around there is that although, in particular cadet setting, you're obviously much more expert than me, Scott, but, in cadet setting, I think rules are going to need to be clear, and particularly in things like combat situations, etc. There needs to be clear change of commands. But I imagine that actually, you can be a very good soldier in many ways by following those rules, but actually you're probably not able to be a cadet who's moving on to kind of more leadership positions unless you're able to actually have the character virtues to know how to set those rules, how to interpret those rules, how to help other people interpret those rules in the different sorts of situations that you come around as well. So it's a really important stage, I think, in young people's lives when they can leave the home. And I think there's particular need for character within a cadet's setting.
In your book, Thrive, you consider and discuss the React and the Thrive models. Could you explain these models?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to say is my book, Thrive, and I've actually got another one coming out this year called Future Proof, which is kind of a companion piece, but more for schools around a kind of a digital citizenship education curriculum. Both of them are designed to be very practical. They're completely based on kind of theory, particularly moral theory, but they are designed to be practical, but they're definitely not manuals. They are not something you can pick up and you kind of read through and you follow those things and your children are going to come out and be beautifully wise and make all the best character-based decisions. It's just not out there. So they are designed to be practical. And I thought one way to help that practical approach was to include a couple of models in there, which maybe just, if anything else, just help kind of parents remember some key points from the approaches that I'm trying to say and give a kind of a framework to hang some of the advice that I'm giving in this book. So the React model is really showing the journey from rules to character, which I've mentioned a couple of times in the recording already. So in terms of the kind of terms it stands for, the R is for rules which are clearly absolutely necessary and should be in place. As I say, I think you'd be unwise to let your child completely free and loose with a smartphone at the age of 11 without putting any restrictions on. So they're completely there. But in many ways, they're foundational and they're often the minimum expectations and about kind of managing or helping children to avoid harm. But if we want to have elevated expectations, we need to show them how to do that. And that's what the E is, that being good exemplars of this in ourselves. And having good exemplars around us. In a way, we've got to help children to live within this digital world. It's not actually going away. They've got to actually experiment and try it out and learn from it. And therefore, we need to take the role of as advisors very often. We may not know about the technology and it keeps changing and we may not know the terms, but what we do know about is a lot about often what is kind of the right character-based decision. We can help our children think through the dilemmas that they're facing day in, day out online. The C stands for character champion with model, which is really just, as I say, championing character qualities as the ultimate kind of aim of a cyber wisdom approach to character, because it's helping our children to really see that things like compassion, honesty, integrity, courage, justice, all these really important virtues really matter. And the T of the models for Thrive, which is hopefully what will happen if you follow the React model, but also is, and I'll explain this very briefly, but Thrive stands for the key sorts of qualities I think we need to help our children develop. And these are being thoughtful, thinking about really the human nature of interacting online, being reason able to be able to kind of think through the sorts of different moral reasons that children face, Integrity, as seen as different from just making continuous honest decisions, so not just the one-off one, but actually what is a life in integrity? Who is that identity that you're actually representing in all of your digital interactions, particularly given that digital legacy is such a big thing right now? Focus on the other virtues not mentioned there. And ultimately, the E of Thrive is hopefully encourage young children, young people to be exemplars themselves in a form of a virtuous circle, because ultimately these children and young people are going to be the ones who are creating the technology for future generations, but also parents, employers, and friends, etc. And therefore, it's very important that hopefully they're exemplars in that space themselves. So the React and Thrive models were just ways of kind of really highlighting, I think, some of the key sorts of people that both parents need to be and the key qualities that I think we should be seeking to help our children develop.
That's really interesting. And I know that your book is really geared toward parents and educators helping their children. In today's society, I've often heard that these young people are referred to as Generation Z or Gen Z. And like you said, their digital interactions are ubiquitous. That's pretty much everything they do has to do with online, it seems. And here at West Point, when our cadets graduate, they are commissioned as second lieutenants. Many of them are going to be about 22 years in age. They'll go into the Army and they'll immediately get a platoon of about 40 people, 40 soldiers or so. And they're going to be in charge of these other that are from the same generation. So what are your thoughts about the importance of these young leaders that are going to be in charge of other young people having a good understanding or help them maybe use the React model in interacting with their soldiers?
Yeah, I mean, I think it wasn't obviously designed, as I've already said, it's not a manual. It's a way, I think, of trying to explore that journey from rules, which, as I said, necessary, to character. But I think as you speak now, it would be very applicable in other situations, because really we want so many of our leaders in many ways, as well as kind of the people we work alongside, to show these qualities. You know, all organisations require some rules, some codes of conduct, some standards to be in place about what the expectations are for that. And this would definitely be the case for, you know, as you say, Gen Z students who are actually kind of coming and taking more kind of leadership responsibilities. You know, they have to be the rule maker, but you want them to be the exemplar as well. You want them to have people kind of following them and leading by example. But then a lot of this is so situational and relational and human. So actually, you know, those second lieutenants when they're positioned are also having to kind of work with individuals and kind of build relationships with them. And that's done through kind of, I think, very much, and not just teaching, you know, people in their command how to be, but actually kind of mentoring them, coaching them, supporting them, advising them, and giving that kind of particular bespoke advice to the individual, given them the situation. So advisory role is very clear. I've said a lot about character and the importance of character ultimately for kind of flourishing individual societies, and, you know, hopefully championing the character of those in their command will be really important as well. So I hadn't actually conceived the model as being used in other sorts of situations, but now you say it, I think it certainly does have some, could be replicated in, or hopefully, dare I say it, may be useful in other situations as well.
Yeah, that's interesting in that, you know, I've known you for some time, and a lot of your work in a variety of contexts, whether it's cyber or just generally character education, I've really tried to take that and mold it to what we do in the military. And so while you probably are not gearing it for that, I will say that it's been very effective and very useful for us. And so I appreciate all the work you do and what you do. So thank you for that. Before I let you go, I want to mention that on your podcast, Conversations on Character, you ask your guests to pick a virtue from a hat and then describe an exemplar of that virtue from your life or from history. And I don't have a hat with me today, Tom, but I would love to know a virtue that is important to you, an exemplar of that virtue. If I could put you on the spot, I would say you and cyber-phronesis, but you probably would say something different.
Yeah, you really have put me on the spot here, Scott. And if nothing else, as I say, learning through experience is a good way to learn. So I do this to my guests all the time, and now I might feel under pressure to think of both a virtue and an example of that virtue. I'm pausing for thought as the brain churns over. What I'm working through is and this is what's coming into my brain, is all the people who are not exemplars of different virtues right now in these sort of situations. But I think this sort of thing, that I'm a great believer of the kind of down the road hero or role model, because I think quite often we do see these great exemplars, and quite often they come up in my podcast, people like Gandhi and Nelson Mandela, etc., who clearly are people who we aspire to. But often what's most empowering for children in schools down the road is just watching someone local who's relatable, who's close to them, a near peer, if you like. And I'm thinking of, kind of people I know from the local school here, a child who's really stood up kind of incredibly courageously. I also see courage as, particularly moral courage, as probably one of the hardest virtues to really show and practice. We all think it's good, but when you all push, it's so hard to sometimes show that moral courage in a particular situation. And seeing children who just know that it's the right thing to stand separate from their peers. The situation I'm thinking about right now, obviously I can't name names, is someone who knows that there's been wrongdoing going on online in this particular school, and has stood up against, kind of loyalty to peers and called out this particular situation, which needed to be called out, and had the brave step to actually enable them to do that. So when you hear stories like that of kind of just inverted commas, kind of ordinary people in a school who just felt that this situation had gone on too much and they need to call it out, that's the sort of thing that really makes my heart sing, I think, in many ways, because I just know how difficult it is to show moral courage, but how important it is to us all going forward. So hopefully I've got to an answer there somewhere in the end, Scott.
Absolutely. No, and we find that same kind of dilemma here at West Point. Are you loyal to your friends? It's the loyalty dilemma. Or are you loyal to the moral education or doing the right thing and moral virtue? So I totally understand that. I have to say, it's been such an honor having Dr. Tom Harrison of the Jubilee Center for Character and Virtues and the University of Birmingham on the Character Cut podcast today. Tom, thank you so much for being with us today.
You're very welcome, Scott, and thank you so much for your challenging but yet thoughtful questions. Thank you.
Please look out for the next episode of the podcast soon. For Character Cut, I'm Dr. Scott Parsons.
On Point is a production of the WPAOG Broadcast Network. Please take a moment to rate and review the show and join us each week for a new episode. Thank you for listening.